Let's begin with the Lord's Prayer. Our Father, Amen. Well, we have finally reached the end, which you probably thought would never come. We've been listening to Matthew, remember, the gospel writer, Matthew. And we've been listening to him as he has given us some advice regarding how we can live our lives in a community that oftentimes is characterized by dissension and division and all of those kinds of things. He seems to us to be a good person to give us advice because the communities that he evangelized seem to have the very same problems or similar problems as to the same ones we have, and so rather than just reinvent the wheel, why not ask him how he fared? And so we've been going through these points of advice that he's been giving us. There are 10 of them. We looked at 8 of them. 2 more today. The 9th one is, originally I phrased it as choose life. But as I was going through the material again, I don't think that's really the best title to use. It's really about choosing honor. That would have been important for Matthew because, remember, he lived in a culture, 1st century Palestine, a culture where everything evolved around 2 polarities. One was honor and the other was shame. And if we would have lived at that time, almost from as early as we could ever remember, we would have been told how important it is to be honorable. What a magnificent virtue honor was. Everything we do in our lives should be done for honor. Then we'd have been told anything that diminishes honor is called shame. And then we would have been told avoid shame at all costs. And there are stories that Matthew has which exemplify both. Probably one of the more famous ones we find in the Gospels is not in Matthew but in Luke, the so-called prodigal son, where you find a young son who shames his father and himself, and that the outcome of that should have been the father would have shunned this kid and pretended like or acted like he was no longer his son. That's what everybody would have expected. But when you read that story, at the end you discover that the father figure there does not shun the kid. Matter of fact, brings him back almost like a king, puts a new robe on him, a ring on his finger, sandals, everything. We'd have a lot of questions about that. In Matthew, of course, the notion of honor is located in the family. That's where you learn about honor. That's why the family was so important to those folks, because it's in that context of the family, the daily interactions that everybody has, the carrying out of the responsibilities that everyone had. The father had responsibilities. The mother had responsibilities. As children came along and grew up, they too would have responsibilities, and fulfilling those responsibilities was called honor. It was expected. to be honorable. That's what we do. We are honorable people. And if we do happen to get involved in shame, we want to turn that around as quick as we can. And the first thing we do, of course, is to ask for God's forgiveness for our shameful actions, our shameful behavior. So if you were asked or wanted to ask Matthew, well, where would I go to learn about honor? We would think he would say, well, go to one of these families. Or we might say, how did Jesus do this? Well, Matthew might scratch his head a little bit and say, well, as many things Jesus does, it's not as simple as we'd like it to be. And then he might say, I got a story I can tell you about Jesus and honor and the family. And it caused quite a bit of stir when it happened. Of course, we like that idea, so we'd be paying attention. The story's found in chapter 12 of the Gospel of Mark, or Gospel of Matthew, starting with verse 43. Jesus has been conversing with some people, some of his enemies, some people who have objected to him, trying to challenge him, and so forth. And so here's what he says. While he was still speaking to the crowds, Jesus' mother and his brothers were standing outside waiting to speak to him. Nothing wrong with that. That could have happened to anybody. We're doing something, you know. I'm in here talking to you, and somebody could come in that door and say, your mother and brothers, remember, they're out here, they'd like to talk to you. All right, no problem. Someone told him, look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside waiting to speak to you. But to the one who told him this, Jesus replied, and this is what we'd find upsetting. Who is my mother? And who are my brothers? To which we would just shake our head. That's really a no-brainer. You know, we know mother, brothers, look, see, that's who are your mother and brothers. And pointing to his disciples. So his family's over here, really, and the disciples are over here. Now he's pointing to his disciples. And pointing to his disciples, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. We just look at it. What do you mean, here? Which one of those syllables don't you understand? Here, right here. These guys, you know, they've been hobnobbing with me. Right here is my mother and brothers. And here's his reasoning. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother. Well, we might have heard that passage a lot, or maybe we've read it ourselves. And, well, it's kind of interesting. It's really very upsetting if you would know the culture of the time, and if you would know what you should and should not expect of Jesus. One of the things you don't do, one of the things we would say you can't do, you don't redefine family. Family was that basic unit of grace, really. And you had the highest respect for family. You did everything for family. That was the honorable thing to do. When Jesus comes along and redefines family, we wouldn't have said, well, that was really interesting. That was pretty neat. I like that idea. No, we would just wonder, where have you been? What on earth got into you? What have you been drinking or whatever, Your mother and your brothers are your blood relatives. They're here. But in the kingdom of heaven, that's not how it works. In the kingdom of heaven, family is now redefined. And the redefinition of family is no longer along blood ties. And even in our cultures, we know how strong that is. Now family is defined by faith. Family is defined by faith. And that becomes very important. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven. In other words, putting it into practice. Whoever does that is my brother and sister and mother. Well, we don't get much more of a reaction from that, but we can imagine that people who heard that, people who were there, it was kind of like in one of the other Gospels, in the Gospel of Mark, remember, in chapter 6, where Jesus has been gone for a long time. He left his hometown of Nazareth, maybe around the age 30 or so. Nobody knows why he left, but he left and went up north. And we had been hearing rumors, of course, that he went up there and he's been preaching. Well, that wouldn't make any sense to us. He never preached when he was here. I mean, he was, along with his father, he and Joseph, they were a little above handyman. They wouldn't call him a handyman, but a craftsman. And they probably every day went over to a neighboring town called Sepphoris, which King Herod was rebuilding to make himself one of those Las Vegas, like whatever happens in Sepphoris stays in Sepphoris. And so Jesus probably got a good glimpse of what that kind of life is like. But that's where he would have spent his days, and then at night he would have come back, and then all of a sudden he wasn't there. Didn't give us a word as why he was going, where he went, or anything, but we heard the rumors. We heard he was up there preaching, and he was healing. Well, he never healed down here. And now we heard he's going to come back. Well, it's very interesting when he comes back, because if you've ever had experiences in small rural communities, like the ones I live in, they're very conservative. They don't like outsiders, for the first place, coming in. We don't like people telling us what to do. We don't like anything big. We don't like big churches. We don't like big schools. We don't like big business. We like things small where we can handle them. We don't like the fact that everybody's taking our kids and attracting them away to some other place so that they don't come here and carry on our traditions. We don't like that, but there's not much we seem to be able to do about it. And so what we really resent is when one of our kids goes off and seemingly makes it well. Everybody's talking about how successful they've been. Then they come back here and they tell us how to live our lives. We don't like that at all. We don't want to hear that from you. And now just Jesus of Nazareth, one of the guys down the block, he's gone, and now we hear he's coming back. Well, isn't that good? Now, he knows all this. So there's not a surprise bone in his body. And he does go back. And of course, he preaches in the synagogue. And they look at him, and, where did this guy get all this? Where'd you learn this stuff? You never did this when you were here. And who are you to be telling us how this all works? Aren't you Joseph's boy down the block here? No, we know your family. I mean, after all, we've been here forever. Who do you think you are? And it gets worse. I mean, he knows what they're going to say, and he's kind of prepared. No prophet is acceptable in the prophet's hometown. And we all know that's true. You got to go out of your own home and do something fancy, and then they're, oh boy, what was really great, but you do it at home and they don't even pay attention to you. I live with 70 other people, and I know that's exactly how it works. When I go home, they'll look at me and say, "Well, have you been gone?" "No, I haven't been gone now. Forget it." "I didn't think you were, but I just wanted." So that's how he operates. And at the end of that story, where again he's redefining what it means to be a family person, at the end of that story it said he could do no works of power because of their lack of faith, their hardness of heart. And he never goes back home. That's the last time according to the Gospel of Mark. So it's very important, this honor, this family stuff, but now Jesus has redefined it. And by redefining family, keep in mind what that also does. That also adds an aspect that's very important in terms of family. And of course, he redefines all that. Family is not simply by blood. And that means family can include anybody with faith. There is no exclusion of people because they're not just like us. Anybody who has faith can be my brother and my sister, my mother, all of that sort of thing. Pretty interesting, and they won't forget that. They won't forget that. Redefining family. So we need to ask, probably Matthew, what do you, by giving us that advice, Matthew, by choosing honor, how's that going to help us out? Well, we'll have to wait and see later, a little bit later on. But he says it's going to help you out because one of the issues we've had all along is we tend to be too exclusive. We tend to spend more time telling people they don't belong than showing people that they do, making people jump through all kinds of hoops so they can feel like they're part of us and not really helping them at all. And Matthew says, you really can't do that. That's only going to cause more dissension, more division, and that's not going to be a way to get over. At the end of the gospel, and this is the final piece of advice that Matthew has for us, final piece of advice is go out to all the nations. And we find that in the very ending of the gospel in chapter 28, starting in verse 16. Now by this time, Jesus has gone through his whole ministry. He's been arrested, he's been put on trial, they found him guilty, they accused him of being an insurrectionist, which meant that he was a threat to the state somehow or other. They had crucified him, which was the worst kind of capital punishment, reserved mostly for insurrectionists, people who are a threat to the government, as well as runaway slaves. If you were a Roman citizen, you could not be crucified because it was considered such a low level of execution that no decent person would have to go through that, as if you could be a decent person and get executed anyway. But that's what they did. So Jesus has been through all that, and now he has been raised from the dead. And Matthew has some rather dramatic events when Jesus is raised from the dead. Earthquakes take place, the whole world shakes, and everybody who tried to disprove him and whatnot ends up sort of just falling over. And then here's his last gathering, the very last saying. He's been raised from the dead. And he's going to have one more meeting with his disciples. And so in chapter 28, starts in verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee. Remember, Judas is gone. So rather than have 12, we've got 11. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. Remember when he gave us the Sermon on the Mount, he went on a mountain. Transfiguration happened on a mountain. So a mountain is generally the location for some kind of divine communication. So they went to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshiped him. But some doubted. It's an interesting little piece of information there, just kind of stuck in there, but some doubted. How could you doubt at this point? I could see how you could doubt early on in the ministry when he was doing this and that and you couldn't really tell, and when he redefined family and you thought, wow, that's really getting out there, and some of the other kinds of things, okay. But now when he's gotten through all of that, he survived actually his own death. God has now raised him up into new life, and some still doubted. Why would Matthew put that in there? Well, probably for a good reason, because he knows that some of us will doubt. Some of us are doubting. Maybe not full-fledged, but we got some question. You know, I'm not real sure about this raising from the dead stuff. You know, I'm not really, that's beyond anything I can imagine. I've heard of people like Lazarus was brought back to life. They got a term for that, resuscitation. But we all know the downside to that was he's going to die again. But Jesus was not resuscitated. He was given this, what the new word is, resurrection, a new way of living. And he says, if we can believe in that, we also will inherit that new way of living. But isn't that a little too much to believe? I mean, there's no proof. We've asked over and show us a sign, show us proof. Where is it? Well, it's not a matter of proof. It's not a matter of signs. It's a matter of faith. And if you have faith, then you can go in this direction. But if you don't have faith, it's going to be nonsense. And so we find ourselves sometimes kind of in between. We're not really not believers, but as Matthew points out time and time again, we're little believers. We're little believers. And so Matthew really is giving us permission to doubt. He's saying, well, you know, those guys who were closest to Jesus, the ones that hobnobbed with him, went everywhere, saw him do everything, they doubted too. So if you can doubt and still hang in there, you'll be okay. You'll be okay. But don't beat yourself up because you doubt. Because there's a lot of other people, and it almost started as soon as Jesus was raised from the dead. And some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, here's his final words, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Remember in the temptation stories in Matthew's gospel? That's what the devil wanted Jesus to prove. Prove to us, prove to me that you have all authority, and throw yourself down and do this and do these miraculous things and prove you are who you are. And he absolutely would not. But now he's telling us he didn't have to do that. He has gotten all authority. God has given him all authority in heaven and on earth. And that came with this new gift of resurrection, with this new form of life, radically new form of life that Jesus now has, comes all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Now here's our commission. Here's what we're supposed to be doing in response to all of this. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. And it's that all nations that would catch us, catch our all nations. Because we would say, well, you know, throughout the whole story, he's been saying just the opposite. When he got those 12 disciples and then added some more, remember what he said? Go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In other words, our mission is to go only to the Jews. Do not go to the Gentiles. Do not go to the Samaritans. Only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And he made that very clear. And it was all very clear up until, as I mentioned a couple times now, he ran into the woman who was a Canaanite. And she wouldn't take his explanation as to why he wasn't going to cure her daughter. She didn't care what he thought his mission was. She had a sick daughter. She believed he could cure her, and that's what she was going to get. And she did. From that point on, you get to notice that there's no more speaking about only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And slowly Jesus begins to open up more and more to a broader mission. Till at last, having experienced now this new life he has been given by God, called resurrection, having been raised from the dead, now he has a very different view of all that. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. Radical universality. Once again, it fits in with what Matthew has been telling us. He goes from being narrow to being broad, to being exclusive to being inclusive. And here it's about as inclusive as you can get. All nations. Baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. That's probably a baptismal formula taken from one of Matthew's early churches. And teaching them to obey everything that I have commanded you. Most people think this is a reference to the Sermon on the Mount. That's going to be the main factor in what you're going to be preaching. And you should take that teaching and proclaim it to everyone. Everything that I have commanded you. And remember, and this is the most important thing to remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. You will never be alone. No matter what you feel or what you think, I, in some form or other, will always be with you. In the infancy narrative, he told us to say, we were told the same thing, but we didn't make that connection because he didn't use the words, I am with you always to the end of the earth. He used a technical Hebrew word, Emmanuel. Emmanuel means to the end. Emmanuel means with you always. And that's what Jesus is about. This is a perfect way to end the story. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. The word remember is very, very significant here because remember here in this story, memory is a very important aspect. Memory makes present. Memory makes real. That's why we make memory of our dead. In some way it brings them back again. To be somebody who has memory, that's very, very significant. And remember, I am with you always to the end of the age. So, those are 10 pieces of advice that Matthew has given us. There's some questions that can be asked, and probably should be. Uncertain times, as we know, can prompt us to ask important questions about our faith and about our place in the world. To match the 10 pieces of advice, I put together 10 questions. You don't have to answer them all right now, but I'll tell you what they are in case you want to piddle around with them a little bit. Here's some questions I think we would ask, somebody would ask, in response to what Matthew has just told us. First question: how are we supposed to live as Christians? How are we supposed to live, not just as human beings, but specifically, how should we carry out our lives as Christians? Number two, what are we to do? What are we to do? That's different from saying, what are we to say? We all know we got plenty to say. We say all the time. That's not the question. What are we to do? Remember, all through Matthew's gospel, the emphasis is not on talking, but on doing, putting it into practice. How do we do that? Matthew would suggest, well, one thing to keep in mind, you don't do it alone. That's why Christianity from the very beginning was a communal religion. It was never a religion of isolated individuals. It was always a religion of a congregation of people, like-minded people sharing the same faith. And it had to be that because of the task that we have. Third question: how are we to think? And how are we to feel as Christians? Should we think and feel that it's okay, things are all right, not all right? Or what should we do? How are we to think and how are we to feel? How are we to make sense as Christians of the world that we have to live in and the people that we have to live with? Number four, where do we turn to find truth and meaning? Big question that is. Philosophers, theologians, they got all kinds of responses to that. What is truth? You know, that's even asked in the gospel. Pilate will ask Jesus that question. But it's a good question for us. What is truth? Where do you find it? How would you know it if you ran into it? And what about meaning? Where do we get meaning? How does meaning come about? If I think about my life and I ask myself, does this life of mine mean anything? What am I talking about when I say that? What does that mean, you know? Does my life have any meaning? Because you run into people, we all probably have had some of that, who don't seem to have any meaning. They can't seem to find any meaning for their lives. They act that out in some oftentimes not very healthy ways. Truth and meaning, very important concepts to know something about. Where we find truth. It's not just any place, anywhere. Is there any kind of common reality that we can all agree to that says we all agree this is truth? There was a time when it seemed that there was closer to a consensus of maybe us being able to say that. Certainly has pretty much vanished today. You probably can't get 2 or 3 people together to agree on what truth is, let alone what meaning might be. How does truth and meaning find us? The other question was, how do we find it? Well, is there such a thing as it finding us? You might have to think a little about that. How does truth and meaning find us? Here's a 6th question. Who is Jesus? You might say, well, that's a dumb question. What have you been talking about all week? But who is Jesus Christ? Remember, Christ is not his last name. Christ is a title. Christus in Greek, Mashiach in Hebrew, meaning anointed in English. People who were anointed primarily were prophets and kings. Jesus was understood to be a prophet in terms of what he did, how he did it. He was anointed as the Messiah, and he was supposed to be the successor of the great king, King David. And that kingdom was supposed to last forever. Forever. And so whenever you say, I believe in Jesus Christ, you're saying, I believe that Jesus is the Messiah. I believe that he is the anointed king, that God has anointed him king. But how do we get to that? Is he just another person? Or is he a person at all? Some like to think, well, he's divine, and if he's divine, he's way beyond us, but none of the Gospels go in that direction. All of the Gospels insist, if you want to know how Jesus is divine, if you want to encounter Jesus as God, you have to do it through his humanity. That's why he came on earth, to show us who he was. And you can't find that out by erasing who he is, saying, well, he can't be just a human being. He's totally more than that. But the churches have been saying all along, he's both and. Fully human, fully divine. What does following Jesus mean? Well, we try to get at that a little bit through asking Matthew a question or two. But now at the end of the week, what would we say? What do you think it means to be a follower of Jesus? Does that mean we simply learn how to think in a certain way? Does that mean we learn how to talk in a certain way? Certain words we say, other words we don't? Or does that mean, no, there's more than that. It's a way of life. If you follow Jesus, that means you have to understand and be familiar with what he taught. And then when you are familiar with what he taught, you have to be able to have some kind of a plan on how you take what he taught and assimilate it to yourselves and then put it into practice. And that's not always easy. That's not always easy for us, because when we discover what it means, we also discover that it could easily get us into trouble. Not everybody will agree with what it means to be a follower of Jesus and the ramifications of that. It means you have a certain set of values. It means you look on people in a different way than those who do not follow Jesus. It means you are very inclusive and not very exclusive. All of these things are part of what it means to follow Jesus and to be prepared for rejection. Because not everybody thinks this is the way one ought to live. Not everyone thinks being a Christian and following Jesus is virtuous. A number of people just think it's crazy and you ought to get over it. Well, maybe we are crazy, but we're not going to get over it. Another question: how do we see God in relation to ourselves in our world? Is there a God? Many would say, that's a silly question, you can't ask that. Of course there is. Well, where do you find it? The gospel writers tend to say, really, the only place you discover God is where you find Jesus. Because, as John's gospel says, nobody has direct access to God. Nobody has ever seen God, that gospel says, except Jesus. And so if you want to know who God is, you have to find out who Jesus is, because the only way you know God is by going through Jesus. And that's why we have 4 of these stories, because one is just not enough to capture who Jesus really is, how he really manifests God. And so when the gospel writers tell us these stories, these parables, these healings, these miracles, these confrontations, they're all telling us something about God. We are seeing God in action when we see Jesus. And oftentimes that's very challenging. What values, this is the 9th question, what values do we want to foster in ourselves and others? What values are not there that we want to be there? How would we get them there? How would we implement them? How would we even discover them? How do you do all of that? Values. What are, and we're back almost to the first question, what are the Christian values that we want to proclaim, maintain, have the world run by? Final question. What desires does God want us to have so that we might find the right decisions and design concrete strategies for action that can create a better world for ourselves and those who come after us? That's a question for all of us. It's kind of a special question, though, for our leaders. That's the task that really leading a Christian community, that's what that leadership is about. Figuring out, how we make our right decisions based on what we value, based on what we understand by Jesus and his teachings, and put that all together. How we, in a sense, create church. There are 3 responses to all these questions, at least 3, but I'll tell you 3. On the one hand, way over on one side, you might get the response asking all these questions. Now what? Here's the response. Everything's fine. Don't change anything. Cut out what doesn't fit. Put new life into the old traditional patterns of behavior. So there'd be some who'd say that, it's really not that bad. We just keep it. We got what we need, and kind of fix it up a little bit, and then we'll be on our way. Then there's a little more centrist position. Some might say, we have to accommodate the past. We have to adjust to our new situation. Things aren't like they used to be. We need to grow, but always in harmony with our past. Our growth can never be cutting off ourselves from our past, and we'll lose our lifeline. So that's different than the first response. The second response doesn't say everything's okay, as the first one did. We got some stuff to do, but also we've got to maintain our tradition. We can't just leave it go. And then we got, of course, usually, as there always are, people on the other end. Break clearly with the past. Get rid of it all. Create new solutions to meet our new times. You have to transform our world. You hear a lot of that kind of talk today in leadership issues, and what we got to do, get out there, all of that. Now, there's more responses than just 3, but these would be 3. One on this side, one on the middle, one on the other side. And you'll hear them all. You know, you won't necessarily agree with them, but you'll hear them all. The real question is, what is your response? What do you think we're supposed to be doing? And what do you think your responsibility is to do it? Remember, words are cheap. We like words, but it's not a matter of being just wordy. It's a matter of putting it into practice. How do we do that? Do we just pretend that everything's all right with just a little fixing up, it'll be okay? Do we think, well, we don't have to do a whole lot, but we got to stay connected to our past? You can't really do that. Or are there some who say, the thing's bankrupt. It's all spent. You can't expect it to do anymore. Those are not the only three responses. But from your life, from your perspective, from your faith, what would you think if you were asked these 10 questions based on what maybe you can remember from the advice Matthew gave us with his 10 pieces of advice, and maybe draw up your own plan? If I wanted to be a follower, an authentic follower of Jesus, what would that look like in my life? And if we could all do that, I suspect we could make some interesting changes. If, of course, we would all do that. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit. Thank you.
Dear friends, as we come to the end of this week of Midday Scripture Reflections, I'd just like to offer a few words of thanks. This is a wonderful way, a kind of a capstone, as it were, on our Lenten observance as we come to the end of, really towards the end of the Lenten season, and we begin Holy Week this Sunday with Palm Sunday. I'd like to say a few words of thanks as we come to this point. I'd like to thank, first of all, the Archdiocesan Communications team who've been responsible for live streaming these talks and making them available to so many beyond those who've been able to come here, as you have been able to come. I want to say thanks to them. I'd like to say thanks also to the team responsible for preparing the lunches every day. They've done a wonderful job, deeply appreciative of their efforts, and I'm sure all those of you who have enjoyed the lunches are appreciative as well. I want to say thanks to them too. I want to thank all of you who've taken the time to come and spend here and to benefit from the learning of Father Eugene. He's a scripture scholar, and he enjoys sharing, imparting his knowledge and his insights with groups like this. So we'd like to thank all of you who've taken the time to come and to bring this kind of conclusion to your Lenten observance as well. I was only able to make yesterday and today due to the fact that the Apostolic Nuncio's visit overlapped with a part of these talks. But it's always my intention to be present here for these events, for these talks. And finally, I'd like to thank Father Eugene. Father Eugene has actually been giving these talks like this over the past 16 years. Just only last year we weren't able to have it either in person or digitally because of an unfortunate mix-up. But he's been doing this over the past 16 years. Clearly he's committed to it, and clearly he enjoys doing it, and I'm extremely grateful for it. I'd like to offer him just a small token of our appreciation for this. Father Eugene, come forward, please. This book is a pictorial on Junkanoo. All Bahamians know what Junkanoo is. It's the preeminent cultural festival for us here in the Bahamas. Many people witness it as spectators, some even participate as active participants in it. This is a pictorial of recent vintage. I'd like to give it to you, and as you page through it, I'd like for you to think fondly of us as we think fondly of you and express our profound gratitude for what you've done for us. Thank you very much.
sing or dance.
Great. And finally, I'd just like to say this. Think about it. Next Friday this time, it'll be Good Friday. We'll be in the midst of the Easter Triduum, the celebration of the Paschal Mysteries. And so, as we come to the conclusion of our Lenten observance, which ends, of course, as you know, with the beginning of the Mass of the Lord's Supper on Holy Thursday, this coming Thursday. As we do so, I want to wish you all the very best. I want to wish you every grace and blessing for the fullest benefits of not only this Lenten season, but the celebration of the death and resurrection of the Lord that we are about to celebrate so soon. Thank you very much. God bless you all.